The Texas summer night carried the kind of heavy stillness that only small towns seem to know. Crickets hummed in the fields, porch lights glowed faintly on Willow Lane, and at the heart of it all stood the church, a white-painted chapel with tall windows and a cross that gleamed under the moonlight. Tomorrow would be filled with flowers, music, and the kind of whispered prayers that mark a wedding day. For weeks, the congregation had been buzzing. Their beloved pastor, the man who had baptized their children and buried their elders, was finally getting married. Pastor David Turner was the kind of figure people trusted without question. At 45, he had the stern jaw and silvering hair of someone who had carried the weight of faith on his shoulders a long time. He preached about duty, about truth, about staying the narrow path. People called him a shepherd, a moral compass in a world that seemed to have lost its way. Some said it was about time he found a companion to walk with him. And when Sarah Mitchell entered his life, it felt, to everyone watching, like God's hand had finally answered that need. Sarah was 32, graceful but approachable, with a warm smile that softened even the most guarded parishioners. She joined the church choir not long after moving to town, and it wasn't long before her clear soprano voice became the soul of Sunday mornings. To the congregation, she seemed like a blessing dropped from heaven, quiet, devoted, always quick with a casserole when someone fell ill. She carried herself with the poise of someone who had known struggle, but kept it private. People admired her for that. She had become, in less than 2 years, the pastor's constant shadow. Now, on the eve of their wedding, the town buzzed with the kind of gossip that wasn't really gossip, more like eager anticipation. Mrs. Whitman, the church secretary, had spent the afternoon threading white roses through pew bows. The local bakery delivered a 3-tiered cake decorated with scripture verses in icing. Teenagers rehearsed as ushers, and the organist ran scales late into the night. Everyone wanted it perfect. After all, this wasn't just any wedding. This was their pastor's wedding. Inside his modest parsonage, David sat in his study, Bible open on the desk, but unread. The lamplight caught the lines in his face, deepened by the mix of nerves and exhaustion. He had performed dozens of marriages, but tomorrow he would be standing at the altar not as the officiant, but as the groom. He told himself it was right. It was good. He deserved companionship. And Sarah, sweet Sarah, was a gift he didn't deserve but had somehow been given. Across town, in a quiet rented house on Maple Street, Sarah moved carefully through her bedroom. Her gown hung on the closet door, the veil draped like a cloud over the chair. On her dresser sat a wooden box, small, polished smooth from years of handling. It was the only thing in her room that didn't fit the image of a glowing bride-to-be. She brushed her fingers across it for a moment, then pulled her hand away as though the surface burned. With a quick breath, she turned back to her packing, lipstick, jewelry, the perfume she'd bought just for tomorrow. The box stayed shut. For the townspeople, the story was simple. A lonely pastor, a devoted woman, a love finally crowned. But beneath the surface, there were whispers, nothing malicious, just the natural curiosity of people who had watched their pastor remain single for so long. Why now? Why her? But the whispers never grew into questions. To question the pastor's choices felt like questioning God himself. David tried to pray that night, tried to center himself in Scripture, but knots sat in his stomach that wouldn't loosen. He remembered the way Sarah had looked earlier, her laugh bright, but her eyes carrying a flicker of something he couldn't name. He brushed it off. Tomorrow, he told himself, everything would be right. Tomorrow they would stand before God and the congregation and seal their vows. Tomorrow, his life would finally be whole. The clock in his study ticked past midnight. In the silence, the weight of the coming day pressed down heavier than any sermon he had ever preached. Somewhere across town, Sarah lay awake as well, staring at the ceiling, her hands folded on her chest, as if in prayer. Between them stretched a gulf neither fully acknowledged, a secret nestled in that polished wooden box, waiting, like a match beside dry timber, for the smallest spark. By dawn, the chapel bell would toll. By evening, the town would celebrate. And by midnight, that same celebration would turn into horror. The night before the wedding, the parsonage lights glowed late. Pastor David had just finished his final counseling session with a nervous young couple set to wed in June, and he told himself that after tomorrow, he'd no longer need to give others advice about marriage. He'd be living it. With his jacket slung over one arm, he drove his pickup across town to Sarah's little rented house. He told himself it was just to drop off a few hymnals she wanted to carry in her bouquet, a sentimental touch. In truth, he wanted one last glimpse of her before they stood together at the altar. Sarah greeted him at the door with tired eyes but a smile. She was in a silk robe, her hair pinned up messily. The house smelled faintly of lavender and old wood polish. "I still have a million things to do," she laughed nervously, brushing at a pile of folded linens. "But tomorrow, everything will be right." They shared tea at the kitchen table. The conversation was light, about flowers, about the cake delivery, about the rain forecast that worried the ushers. But David felt a current running beneath it, something taut and unspoken. Sarah seemed eager to usher him out when the clock struck 10. She kissed him on the cheek, whispered, "See you at the altar," and disappeared down the hallway. David lingered, unsettled. He told himself he was being silly. Still, his gaze wandered toward the hallway. That was when he noticed her bedroom, door half open, lamplight spilling across the hardwood. He knew he shouldn't intrude. He knew, but some pull stronger than conscience drew him forward. Inside, the room was neat. Gown on the door, veil across the chair, shoes lined like soldiers beneath the dresser. But what caught his eye was the wooden box sitting on the vanity, small, smooth, polished to a sheen. He'd seen it before, once, when Sarah had quickly closed a drawer. Tonight, it sat exposed as if daring him. He hesitated. His chest thudded with a guilt that felt strangely familiar, like temptation. "You're tired," he muttered, half to himself, half to God. But his hand reached anyway. The box was heavier than it looked. He lifted the lid. Inside were keepsakes, a faded ribbon, a photograph of Sarah as a teenager with someone he didn't recognize, a rosary, and beneath them, folded papers. He thumbed through, meaning only to glimpse. But the bold black letters at the top of one stopped him cold. Texas certificate of live birth. His eyes raced down. Name, Michael Aaron Mitchell. Sex, male. Date of birth, March 12th, 1989. The paper trembled in his hand. His first thought was confusion. Was this someone else's? A brother? A cousin? But there was no mistaking the last name, the birth date. The certificate listed the same parent Sarah had once mentioned in stories about her childhood. His mouth went dry. He read the line again and again, the word male searing itself into his mind. He dropped into the chair, the box clattering on the vanity. His thoughts scrambled in 1,000 directions. Could it be a mistake? Could it be forged? And if it wasn't, what did it mean? Images slammed into him. Her smile in the pews, her hand in his at prayer, the whispered blessing of their first kiss. His mind twisted each memory now with a new edge. He heard his own sermons echoing back at him, about truth, about the sanctity of marriage, about man and woman as God intended. Each word came back like an accusation. A sound from the hallway jolted him. Sarah's voice, soft, humming a hymn as she moved about. He shoved the paper back into the box, slammed the lid, and pushed it across the vanity as though it burned him. When she appeared in the doorway, Hair undone, robe tied loose, he forced a smile. "You're still here," she said, a little surprised. "Just leaving," he managed, his voice cracked. He brushed past her with a stiffness she didn't comment on. In the truck, his hands gripped the wheel until his knuckles whitened. The air felt too thin, his lungs refusing to fill. His mind screamed to confront her, to demand the truth. But the thought of the congregation, of their whispers, their laughter, froze him. If he canceled the wedding, questions would pour in. If the truth surfaced, his reputation, his sermons, everything would collapse. He told himself he could push it down just for tomorrow. He would marry her. He would smile for the congregation. He would deal with it later, in private. But as he drove through the dark Texas streets, every street lamp cast long shadows across his windshield, and every shadow whispered the same word over and over: liar. By the time he reached the parsonage, his jaw was clenched tight, his throat raw from silence. He dropped into his armchair, staring at the cross on the wall. His lips moved in a prayer that was no prayer at all, half plea, half curse. Somewhere across town, Sarah laid down beside her wedding gown, tears dampening her pillow. She had seen the way he looked at her just then, like a man who had glimpsed a truth too sharp to bear. She clasped her hands and whispered, "Tomorrow will be okay. Tomorrow he'll love me enough to stay." Neither of them slept. The night ticked on, cruel and slow, toward the altar. Morning broke bright and merciless, the kind of Texas sunshine that bleaches the streets and leaves no shadows to hide in. The chapel stood adorned in white and gold, its steps crowded with neighbors, choir members, and parishioners who had come not just for a wedding, but for a spectacle. After years of seeing their pastor alone in the parsonage, here at last was his moment of joy. Laughter rang through the air, children tugged on parents' hands. Women in hats fanned themselves against the heat. Everyone wanted a front-row glimpse of a union that promised to be blessed by heaven itself. Inside, Pastor David Turner adjusted the stiff collar of his suit. His reflection in the mirror showed a man who should have been glowing, but the hollowness in his eyes betrayed him. He pressed his palms together, whispering a prayer that was more bargaining than devotion. "Lord, give me strength. Let me endure this day." His heart pounded with every toll of the bell, each chime a countdown he couldn't stop. Sarah, meanwhile, stood in the bridal room, wrapped in satin and lace. Her veil shimmered like morning mist, her bouquet a burst of roses and lilies. Women from the choir clustered around her, dabbing at her cheeks, cooing about how radiant she looked. To them, she was the perfect bride, gentle, devoted, a beacon of hope for a man of God who had waited too long. But behind her smile, her hands trembled. She had seen David's stiff posture last night, the way his words faltered. She wondered if he had glimpsed something he wasn't ready to face. Yet here she was, standing in a gown she never thought she'd live to wear, determined to step forward no matter what storms brewed behind his eyes. When the organ swelled and the doors opened, the congregation gasped as Sarah entered. Veil trailing, she moved slowly down the aisle, the rhythm of her steps steady against the hum of whispers. David stood at the altar, tall and solemn, the Bible clasped tight in his hands. Their eyes met, and for a moment the world seemed to hold its breath. The vows began, words David had recited countless times for others. Yet today, every line tasted bitter. "Do you take this woman to have and to hold in sickness and in health?" His voice cracked on the word woman, but no one seemed to notice. Sarah's gaze shimmered with tears. Her "I do," spoken softly, but with a conviction that silenced even the restless children in the pews. When it came his turn, David hesitated just a beat too long. The silence prickled through the chapel. Then, Forcing the corners of his lips into what might pass for a smile, he answered, "I do." Applause erupted, the organ thundered, and cheers rose from every corner of the church. The kiss was brief, almost mechanical, but to the watching crowd it looked like devotion. The reception that followed unfolded with the easy joy of a small-town celebration. Long tables of potluck casseroles and pies lined the fellowship hall. Choir members sang hymns with harmonies that shook the rafters. Children danced around Sarah's gown, tugging at her train. Parishioners toasted the couple, raising cups of sweet tea and homemade wine. But if you looked closely, if you studied the groom instead of the bride, you'd see the strain in his jaw, the way he flinched at laughter that seemed to mock rather than bless. He shook hands, nodded through congratulations, but his mind never left that folded paper, the word male etched deep into his thoughts. Sarah leaned close once, whispering, "You're quiet. Are you all right?" Her eyes searched his face for the man who had promised her love. He forced a smile, kissed her cheek before the crowd, and said, "I'm just overwhelmed." She wanted to believe him. She needed to believe him. By dusk, the crowd had dwindled, the hall swept clean, and the couple slipped into the back of a decorated car headed toward a nearby hotel. Tin cans rattled on strings. Shouts of blessing followed them down the road. From the outside, it was a picture of joy, a pastor and his bride, finally united. But inside the car, the silence was heavy. Sarah held his hand, her thumb tracing small circles on his skin. He pulled away slowly, staring out the window as the last rays of sunlight bled into the horizon. The congregation would sleep easy that night, satisfied that their shepherd had found his lamb. They couldn't know that within hours, the honeymoon suite would be a crime scene. They couldn't know that the vows they had cheered would unravel into horror before the night was through. The hotel was a modest place off the highway, the kind of roadside inn couples booked when they wanted privacy more than glamour. A red neon sign flickered against the night sky as David and Sarah pulled into the lot, streamers still tied to the back of their car, fluttering in the warm Texas wind. Inside, the honeymoon suite had been prepared with the same generic touches that tried to make every wedding night look magical. A bottle of champagne on ice, rose petals scattered across the bedspread, a card from the manager congratulating Mr. and Mrs. Turner. Sarah laughed softly when she saw it, the sound bright and hopeful. "See, even strangers are happy for us," she said, slipping off her shoes. She moved with the unguarded joy of someone who had dreamed of this night all her life. For her, it was a promise fulfilled. For David, it was a cage closing in. He poured 2 glasses of champagne, his hands trembling as the cork popped. He drank his quickly, swallowing hard, while she sipped hers slowly, savoring. The room smelled faintly of roses and alcohol, but beneath it, to David, there was another scent, something acrid, like fear rising from his own skin. Sarah tried to lighten the moment. She sat on the edge of the bed, veil still draped over her shoulders, and said, "You know, I thought I'd be nervous. But I'm not. I feel safe with you." Her voice was soft, trusting. It should have soothed him. Instead, it felt like an accusation. David's jaw tightened. He set his glass down with a thud. "Protected," he repeated, almost bitterly. "You feel protected with me." Sarah blinked, surprised by his tone. "Isn't that what marriage is supposed to be? A place where you feel at peace." His laugh came out harsh, brittle. He turned away, staring at the wall, at the reflection of the cross on the mirror above the dresser. "Tell me, Sarah," he said quietly, "how long did you plan to keep lying?" Her face drained of color. "What do you mean?" He spun toward her, eyes wild. "Don't you dare play dumb with me. I found it. The box. The certificate." His voice cracked on the word, fury and disbelief tangled together. "You're not who you said you were." Tears welled in her eyes instantly. She shook her head, hands reaching out as if she could physically pull him back from the edge. David, please listen to me. That was years ago. That's not who I am now. I didn't tell you because I was afraid. Afraid of losing you. Afraid of losing this life. But I'm me. I'm the woman who loves you. The woman who stood at that altar with you today. Her words hit him like blows, but instead of softening him, they fanned a fire already raging. He stepped closer, looming over her. You lied to me. You lied to the church. You lied to God. I wanted to live, she whispered, clutching at her veil. I wanted to be seen as who I truly am, not what I was born into. I never meant to hurt you. David's hands shook as he reached for the veil draped over her shoulders. He ripped it away, the fabric tearing in his fists. You stood before God in a white dress, and you expect me to believe that. His voice rose, echoing off the cheap hotel walls. Sarah sobbed, sliding off the bed, crawling backward across the carpet as if distance might save her. David, please. You don't have to do this. We can. But his mind had already snapped. Every sermon he'd preached, every verse he'd quoted, every image of purity and truth he'd held up for his congregation now mocked him. He could see tomorrow's headlines, hear the whispers of his flock. The pastor married a lie. His rage twisted into something darker, something primal. He lunged forward, grabbing the sheer fabric of her gown. She screamed, the sound muffled as he yanked her close. His hands closed around the delicate lace of the veil still clutched in his fists, wrapping it around her throat. Sarah clawed at him, nails raking his skin, desperate for breath. Her bouquet spilled across the floor, petals scattering like drops of blood. She tried to speak, but only choked gasps came out. Confess, he roared, tightening the fabric. Confess what you are. Her eyes pleaded, wide with terror, shimmering with love even in the final seconds. She shook her head weakly, her lips forming silent words. I am me. The struggle lasted less than a minute, but to David it stretched into eternity. When her body finally went limp, when her hands slipped from his arms and fell lifeless to the carpet, the room went deathly silent. The only sound was his ragged breathing, harsh and uneven, as he stared at the crumpled figure in white before him. For a moment he stood frozen, the veil still wrapped in his fists. The champagne glasses glinted on the dresser, untouched. The roses on the bed looked obscene now, as though mocking the violence that had just unfolded. Slowly, he let the fabric slip from his hands. He backed away, chest heaving, eyes darting around the room as if searching for escape. But there was no escape, not from the body at his feet, not from the blood pounding in his ears, not from the truth that had driven him to this moment. Outside, traffic hummed on the highway. In the distance, a train whistle blew. The world carried on, oblivious. Inside the honeymoon suite, love had curdled into horror. And a pastor who had spent his life preaching salvation now stood over the woman he had vowed to cherish, his soul damned by his own hands. The honeymoon suite door stayed shut until late morning. Housekeeping had knocked twice, heard nothing, and finally reported it to the front desk. At 10:42 a.m., the manager himself, annoyed at the lack of checkout, used a master key. What he saw inside made his stomach lurch. The room reeked faintly of champagne and sweat. Rose petals stuck to the carpet in damp clumps. And at the center of it all lay Sarah Turner, motionless in her torn wedding gown, her veil wound cruelly around her neck. The manager staggered backward, gagging, and dialed 911 with trembling fingers. When police arrived, the scene was already drawing a crowd. Guests peered down the hallway, whispering, while paramedics pushed through with a stretcher they would never use. Leading the response was Sheriff Monique Harris, a steady woman in her early 40s with sharp eyes and a reputation for cutting through small-town gossip to find facts. She stepped into the suite, her boots crunching over broken glass from a toppled champagne flute. One glance at the twisted veil and Sarah's contorted posture told her this was no accident. Strangulation, she muttered to her deputy. We're treating this as a homicide. The hotel was sealed off. Crime scene tape stretched across the hallway, while officers photographed every corner of the suite. On the dresser, 2 half-drained champagne flutes gleamed. In a wastebasket, Sheriff Harris noticed a crumpled piece of paper. She pulled on gloves, unfolded it carefully, and read. It was a birth certificate, edges creased and smudged with fingerprints. The name didn't match the woman on the floor. Harris raised an eyebrow, tucking the paper into an evidence bag. She'd handled dozens of murders in her career, but this was something different, something that would ignite a firestorm once the public learned. Within hours, the local medical examiner, Dr. Elaine Chun, confirmed the preliminary findings. Classic ligature strangulation, she told Harris. No sign of forced entry. No defensive wounds beyond what you'd expect for fighting off the attacker. Whoever did this was in close proximity and had her trust. Back at the station, the first calls began flooding in. Parishioners asked why Pastor Turner hadn't shown up to lead morning prayers. Others reported seeing him at the hotel the night before, carrying his bride into the suite under a shower of rice and laughter. Harris made the call to bring him in. When deputies located David at his parsonage, he was sitting at his desk in his robe, Bible open in front of him. His eyes were bloodshot, his face gaunt. He didn't resist when they cuffed him, only muttered, "I was praying." At the interrogation room, Harris sat across from him, folding her hands calmly. "Pastor Turner, your wife was found strangled in your honeymoon suite this morning. Can you explain that?" He closed his eyes, shaking his head slowly. "Someone must have come in, broken in. I don't know. I woke up and she was gone. I thought she'd gone for air." Harris kept her tone even. "There's no sign of forced entry. No one else on security footage entering or leaving that room. Just you." He flinched, but his voice hardened. "You don't understand. She lied. She deceived me. This was not the woman I thought she was." "Is that why you killed her?" Harris pressed. David slammed his fists on the table, eyes blazing. "I didn't kill her, but God's truth was revealed to me. She wasn't who I believed she was. Do you know what would do to me? To my church." Harris stared at him, unblinking. In her mind, his words weren't those of a grieving widower, but of a man cornered by a secret too heavy to carry. Meanwhile, forensic techs built the case piece by piece. Fibers from the torn veil matched ligature marks on Sarah's neck. The champagne flutes carried both their fingerprints, but no one else's. Security footage from the hallway showed David entering the room at 11:38 p.m. with Sarah and no other soul after that until the manager's discovery in the morning. On his forearms, beneath his sleeves, officers found fresh scratches, thin, bloody lines consistent with fingernails fighting for air. By evening, Harris had her timeline. After the reception, the couple had checked into the hotel. They argued. Neighbors in adjoining rooms later reported hearing raised voices, muffled cries, and a heavy thud around midnight. Sometime after that, Sarah Mitchell Turner was strangled to death, and Pastor David Turner, the man the town had trusted to shepherd their souls, was the only person in that room. News spread fast. Reporters swarmed outside the sheriff's office. Microphones thrust forward, headlines already forming. Pastor's bride found dead hours after wedding. Church members cried in the parking lot, torn between disbelief and betrayal. For some, the scandal of Sarah's past, hinted at in whispers from Harris's leaked birth certificate discovery, was enough to justify their pastor's rage. For others, nothing could excuse what had happened. That night, Harris walked the quiet hall of the jail. Through the bars, David sat hunched on his bunk, head in his hands. He looked less like a man of God than a man drowning. When she asked if he wanted to speak to a lawyer, he only muttered, "God will judge me." But in Harris's eyes, judgment was already on the way. The evidence was stacked, the story tragic but simple. The bride's secret had been discovered. The pastor's pride, mixed with fury and fear, had turned lethal. And now, the law would decide what price he would pay for a honeymoon that ended in blood. The courthouse in Houston County was packed to the walls the day Pastor David Turner's trial began. Television crews camped outside, cables snaking across the courthouse lawn, their vans beaming the story to national audiences hungry for scandal. Locals who had once filled pews for his sermons now lined benches as spectators, whispering behind cupped hands. The air in the courtroom felt thick, as if the weight of all those eyes and expectations pressed down on every soul inside. At the front sat Judge Leonard Harlow, a stern man with a clipped mustache and little patience for theatrics. To his left, the prosecution table, Assistant District Attorney Carling Nguyen, sharp in a Navy suit, her notes neatly stacked in front of her. She had built her reputation on tough domestic violence cases and carried herself like a woman who had no doubt about what the evidence would show. To the right, Defense Attorney Samuel Breyer, a seasoned litigator with a flair for sympathy, the kind of lawyer who knew how to turn jurors' hearts even when the facts were grim. When David was led in, shackles around his wrists and ankles, a hush fell over the room. He wore a rumpled gray suit, the same one from his pastoral days, but it hung loose now on his frame. His hair had grown shaggy in jail, his face gaunt. Still, when he raised his eyes to the gallery, a few loyal parishioners clasped their hands as if in silent prayer for him. The indictment was read aloud. 1 count of second-degree murder. The charge carried the possibility of life imprisonment. Nguyen opened with deliberate calm. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," she began, "this case is about trust. Sarah Mitchell trusted the man she married. A pastor, a leader of faith, a man who promised before God to cherish her. And within hours of that promise, he strangled her in a hotel room. The evidence will show this was no accident, no stranger intruding in the night. It was rage. Rage that Sarah was not the person he thought she was. Rage that led to murder." She pointed toward the evidence table, where the bloodstained veil lay sealed in plastic. "This is the weapon he used. Not a gun, not a knife, but the very symbol of her vows." The jury, a mix of middle-aged townsfolk and 2 young professionals from the city, leaned forward, their faces somber. When Breyer rose, his voice was soft, almost fatherly. "This is not the story of a cold-blooded killer. This is the story of a man blindsided, shocked to his very core by a truth hidden from him. My client discovered, on the eve of his wedding, that his bride had deceived him about something fundamental. He acted in confusion, in heartbreak, in the kind of passion that clouds reason. He is guilty of being human, not of premeditated evil." Gasps and murmurs filled the gallery. The judge rapped his gavel. "Order." The prosecution called its first witnesses. The hotel manager who discovered the body, his voice trembling as he recounted opening the door. The maid who described hearing muffled screams through the walls. The forensic team who laid out photographs of the bruising, the pressure marks around Sarah's throat, and the scratches on David's arms consistent with her fighting for her life. Dr. Elaine Shun, the medical examiner, delivered her testimony with clinical precision. Time of death between midnight and 2 a.m. Cause of death, consistent with the veil recovered from the body. No evidence of forced entry. No DNA or fingerprints in the room besides the victims and the defendants. Nguyen's voice sharpened as she held up the crumpled birth certificate. Sheriff Harris found this in the trash can of the suite. Ladies and gentlemen, this is what triggered the defendant's rage. Instead of compassion, instead of walking away, he chose violence. Breyer's cross-examination was pointed. He asked Dr. Chun whether adrenaline and emotional shock could impair judgment. She conceded it could, but held firm, it does not erase responsibility for strangling someone. When the defense began its case, Breyer leaned heavily into character witnesses. Parishioners testified that Pastor Turner had counseled marriages, prayed with the dying, cared for the poor. They painted him as a man of deep faith who had simply reached a breaking point. Then came the most controversial moment. David himself took the stand. His hand shook as he swore the oath. Looking out at the jury, his voice cracked. I loved her. God knows I did. But she lied to me, lied about who she was. I felt mocked, betrayed like my whole ministry was a fraud. I didn't mean to kill her. I only wanted her to admit the truth. His eyes brimmed with tears. I lost control. Nguyen's cross-examination sliced through his sorrow. Pastor Turner, are you telling this jury that discovering a personal truth gave you the right to strangle your wife? He stammered, No, but no further questions, Nguyen said, turning sharply back to her table. The trial stretched 2 weeks, each day feeding headlines across the nation. Protesters gathered outside, some holding signs demanding justice for Sarah, others praying aloud for the pastor's soul. Hashtags like hashtag Justice for Sarah and hashtag Pray for Pastor Turner trended online, splitting the public into camps. Finally, closing arguments arrived. Nguyen stood tall, her voice ringing. This was not a crime of passion. This was a man who made a choice. He discovered something he didn't like, and instead of seeking help, instead of walking away, he chose to kill. Sarah Mitchell deserved love. Instead, she got a death sentence in her wedding gown. Breyer followed with quiet intensity. You cannot judge a man's heart from the safety of this jury box. He was deceived. He reacted in a storm of emotions. That is not the same as premeditated murder. Show mercy, as our faith teaches. The jury deliberated for 9 hours. Reporters camped outside, speculating, while the town held its breath. When they finally returned, the foreman stood, his voice steady. We find the defendant guilty of murder in the 2nd degree. David's head dropped, his shoulders slumping as the weight of the verdict crashed over him. In the gallery, Sarah's family clutched each other, tears streaming. A few parishioners bowed their heads, lips moving in silent prayer. Judge Harlow's sentence was swift. Life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. The gavel struck. The courtroom erupted, some in sobs of relief, others in cries of disbelief. David Turner, once the shepherd of souls, was led away in chains. And in that moment, the illusion of righteousness crumbled, leaving only the undeniable truth. The man who had preached salvation had become a murderer. The weeks after the trial left the little Texas town stunned, like a congregation dismissed without a benediction. The white-painted chapel that once bustled with hymns and potluck suppers now sat quiet, its front doors chained shut, weeds curling up through the steps. A faded for sale sign leaned against the railing. To passers-by, it looked less like a house of God than a monument to shame. On Sundays, the streets were still. Families who once filled pews scattered to other churches or stopped attending altogether. Some spoke bitterly about betrayal, about how their shepherd had led them into darkness. Others clung to him in stubborn loyalty, muttering that the devil had twisted the story, that their pastor was a victim of deception. The community split down the middle, each side convinced the other had lost its way. Sarah's family buried her in a small cemetery on the edge of town. The headstone was simple. Sarah Mitchell Turner, beloved daughter and sister, 1989 to 2023. They left the name she chose for herself, refusing to let the past define her. At the funeral, mourners lined the aisles, some clutching rainbow-colored flowers, others carrying Bibles. The choir sang a hymn she had once led, their voices cracking under the weight of grief. Candles burned along the sidewalk outside the courthouse for weeks. Strangers came from across the state, leaving notes scrawled with hashtags. Hashtag Justice for Sarah. Hashtag Truth Without Violence. Advocates for LGBTQ+ rights called her story a warning, proof of how secrecy, fear, and prejudice could end in blood. News anchors debated her life nightly, some framing her as a martyr, others as a deceiver. The arguments spilled across television screens, talk radio, and comment sections, where cruelty and compassion battled word by word. Behind prison walls, David Turner became a hollow echo of the man he had once been. Guards described him pacing his cell, reciting scripture under his breath, sometimes scribbling sermons he had no congregation to hear. He refused interviews, save one line he offered to a reporter through the bars. "I wanted the truth. The truth destroyed me." His former parishioners avoided mentioning his name. Mothers tugged their children past the boarded-up church, whispering that it was best not to ask questions. For them, silence was safer than reckoning with what had happened. But silence could not erase the images seared into memory: the bride in her gown, the pastor in shackles, the veil that became a weapon. Sarah's friends, though, refused to let her be forgotten. They organized a memorial concert in the town square, her favorite hymns mingled with songs of resilience. Photos of her smiling in the choir, holding casseroles at church potlucks, laughing with neighbors were projected onto a makeshift screen. People cried openly, realizing she had always been more than the secret that ended her life. For those who had once sat rapt as David Turner thundered about truth and purity, the irony was unbearable. He had preached that secrets corrode the soul, that deception leads to destruction. In the end, it was his inability to face the truth with grace that consumed him. Years later, the church was sold to a young couple who turned it into an antique store. The cross remained on the steeple, though dulled by rust. Shoppers browsing the aisles often paused beneath it, wondering what had once been preached within those walls. Locals rarely offered details, but sometimes late at night, the story surfaced again: how a pastor found a piece of paper, how a wedding turned to horror, how truth and fear collided in a hotel room. The lesson lingered, unspoken but heavy. Secrets don't kill, but the fear of them can. And in this town, where faith had once been the strongest glue, the tragedy of Pastor Turner and Sarah Mitchell left a permanent crack in the foundation, one that no prayer, no hymn, no Sunday sermon would ever mend.